One of the things she stressed was she said, you know, I think there have been enough upgrades and enough changes in how we conduct the process of elections. But what I am most concerned about now is, and most worried about, is the effects of social media. And that is really an absolute lead into Sarah's talk today as to how to deal with what's going on and how you can protect yourself. And by you protecting yourself, you can help the electoral process protect itself. Sarah Hood, I've known Sarah for probably, what, 3.5 years?
Yeah.
From a very different setup, very different circumstances, but I've been impressed with what she's been doing out at the college, and particularly in terms of her interest and her ability and her expertise in social media. And so what she's going to talk to us today about is fact versus fiction, how to wade through insanity. And of course, that little emoji that she came up with is the scream, which Edward Munch says scream, and it pretty much expresses how she feels and how a lot of us feel about what's going on now. Sarah is a reference and instruction librarian. She teaches informational literacy at the community college, Santa Fe Community College. Her master's degree in library and information science is from the University of South Carolina, where she is from South Carolina, and where she spent most of her life and her career. And she maintains a professional focus on media literacy. And she's spent a lot of time in recent months and in recent years talking about what is going on and how people can figure out whether something is fake news, disinformation, and what sources that you really can rely on. And with that, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, let me get my screen share up and going here. Okay, so do we see the title page here, Election 2020, Fact versus Fiction, How to Wade Through the Emoji Insanity? Do we see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, hello, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. So I don't know if you all know, but Pat and I, we know each other actually through Band and of course Facebook, and she sees all of the posts that I make about the importance of media literacy and fighting fake news. So she asked me if I'd be interested in speaking today, and I said I'd love to. So I've been an academic librarian for about 16 years now, and I really do consider myself a teacher. I consider myself an educator. But instead of teaching, say, music or math, I teach information literacy. So basically, college professors will bring their classes in. I'll work with them for an hour or so. I show them how to do college-level research. So we being, the staff that I'm a part of, we teach, somewhere between 40-something and 60-something workshops per semester. Now that, of course, is in normal times. Our teaching is very different right now. But anyway, teaching is something that I do a lot of and that I really enjoy. So before I get started, I want to let you all know that any and all sources that I mention, I will provide Krista and Pat a list of those sources, so you will not go away empty-handed. And one of the things that I usually like to do, because it's just fun, is I like to start out with a poll. So we're experimenting with this a little bit. So you should see a poll up on your screen now, and it should be asking you, how closely do you follow election news? So let's go ahead and answer that. And once those answers are submitted, they should come up. And it might just take, in this online world, we have to get used to kind of waiting and some pregnant pauses.
And the panelists are allowed to vote if you want. I think we're probably close to the maximum we're gonna get. So I'm going to
Okay, so yeah, most people follow. So we've got 74%. I'm assuming you all can see this, but just in case, I'll read it out. 74% say they very closely follow the news. 26% somewhat closely. Okay, so I'm going to close this out. Let's do that second question.
Okay. Here we go.
All right, so how concerned
voting.
are you? Yeah, how concerned are you about the effects of fake news on the election?
All right. It looks like we have about the same number of respondents. Probably some people are on devices that aren't quite.
Yeah, it's a
for
little hard
them.
to figure that out when you're not on a computer. No
Yeah.
worries.
So we're going to end polling.
All right, so even more of you are concerned, very concerned about the effects of fake news. So that's 88%, 8% are somewhat concerned, and 4% are not very concerned. All right. All right, so I'm going to close that out. All right, so let's see. All right. So let's see how your responses match up with an almost identical survey from the Pew Research Center, a very highly regarded public opinion source. So if you follow political news pretty closely, then you're probably pretty concerned about the effects of fake news on the election. As you can see here, the vast majority of respondents, 75%, who follow such news more closely are very concerned about those effects. So you're in good company. So we hear these terms a lot: fake news, misinformation, disinformation. Is there a difference? Are they all kind of basically the same thing? What's their relationship to each other? Where did these terms even come from? So according to the OED, the Venerable Oxford English Dictionary, I'm a librarian, of course I've got to bring the OED into this presentation here. It's defined as news that conveys or incorporates false, fabricated, or deliberately misleading information, or that is characterized as or accused of doing so. So many like to credit our current president with coining that term, fake news, but that's actually not true. The use of fake news as a term can be dated back to 1890. And the idea of fake news certainly isn't new. As you can imagine, it's been around for quite some time. So think of, for example, yellow journalism from the late 19th century. But what about this relatively new term that we've heard over the past few years, disinformation? Well, according to NPR, disinformatia, I'm probably mispronouncing that, I apologize, was apparently coined by Joseph Stalin in the 1920s as the name of the section of the KGB tasked with deceiving enemies and influencing public opinion. So this begs an interesting question. If the formal modern concept of disinformation has been around for roughly a century, why and how has it garnered so much attention in the last few years? Well, as you can imagine, the answer to that is social media, which has allowed disinformation to spread at an alarming rate. And that in and of itself could be another presentation altogether. So the use of these different terms, misinformation and disinformation, it reminds me of a classroom experience that I had about a year or so ago. And I'm sure you all know who these two gentlemen are. That's Scott Pelley on the left and Stephen Colbert on the right. So I'm working in a classroom with some students, and we watched this really great clip of Scott Pelley being interviewed by Stephen Colbert. And they're talking about the importance of accurate information in maintaining a good, strong democracy. So we finished the clip, and a student raises their hand and says, well, what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Well, as it turns out, Pelley had been using the term disinformation with a D during the interview, while Colbert had been using the term misinformation. And to be honest, I hadn't even noticed that at the time. But I'm really glad that this student brought that up because it opened up a really good class discussion about it. So as an information professional, I would have to say that the difference between misinformation and disinformation really lies with intent. But the problem is intent can be really hard to infer, particularly in an online situation like what we see, in social media. And this is due to lack of those social cues. So the realm and scope of both of these, they can indeed very easily overlap. So I saw this at a webinar that I attended over the summer, and I'm always amazed at how not new some of these things that we're seeing today are as compared with when they originally appeared in the US news ecosystem, as it were. So these are actual headlines from US papers during the flu pandemic of 1918, as well as the Russian flu a few decades prior. So the description on the right about the electric light producing this, quote unquote, new microbe kind of reminds me of the conspiracy theory about COVID-19 being developed intentionally in a lab. So it definitely feels like history is repeating itself. So I think this certainly shows that troublemakers in the news are certainly nothing new. Now, US news sources, of course, are not the only sources of misinformation. I'm sure we remember that in the 2016 elections, it was thought that there was a great deal of foreign interference and influence. So according to William Evanina, director of the National Counterintelligence Security Center, foreign meddling in elections is still a problem. And not just from Russia, but from Iran and China as well. Although I think with China, the threat is less pronounced because from what I understand, they actually don't want Trump to be reelected. So this kind of reminded me, I don't know if we have any Star Trek Next Generation fans out there, but I'm a Star Trek Next Generation fan. And one quote that always gives me a chuckle is from the leader of the Pakleds, which is a species that was always stirring up trouble and wreaking havoc for the Enterprise crew. And that quote is, "We are nothing if not persistent." So that definitely reminds me of sort of the animus behind some of these foreign interference campaigns. So this is the sort of thing that we can end up with. So on the one hand, it might be tempting to say, well, if they're mostly bots, then at least it's not real people who might take their votes to the polls. But of course, the problem is real voters are seeing the misinformation put up on Twitter by these bots. Not just Twitter, but other forms of social media as well. So that real person's vote may be influenced by a bot. Okay, so why do we fall for fake news in the first place? Well, first of all, it's easy. It takes time and energy to critically evaluate information. I'm always telling my students this, research is hard. It does take time. There are some easy things that I'm going to talk about, in this presentation, but, it does take time to critically evaluate information. So sometimes we humans are not very good at that, particularly if we already feel overloaded and overwhelmed by information. So whether we realize we're doing it or not, we may just simply say, whatever I'm hearing most often or most loudly or whatever makes the most sense, that's just what I'm going to go with. So how might that translate in today's, highly financially driven information landscape? Well, instead of saying, whatever's the loudest, we might say, well, whatever's the cheapest thing that we're hearing. And we might not actually literally think that. This is more subconscious. A lot of this, a lot of what's going on in an information consumer's mind is pretty subconscious. So we might say, well, whatever's the cheapest thing that we're hearing, that's what I'm going to go with because it's right in front of me. It's free. Reason number 2, poor news diet. And what do we tend to think of when we think of a poor news diet? Why, social media. So here's another survey from Pew that shows an inverse relationship between heavy reliance on social media for political knowledge and actual political knowledge. So if you tend to rely heavily on social media, if you're someone who relies on social media to get most of your political news, you're probably not going to be particularly well informed. So reason number 3, need for certainty. And this is where it gets kind of psychological. I mean, we've already been, a lot of this is already psychological, but this kind of really gets a little deeper. Now, conspiracy theories, I know this headline, kind of, oh, what are we getting into conspiracy theories? And this is something I occasionally talk to my students about. Conspiracy theories and fake news aren't necessarily the same thing, although one typically begets the other. But I think the same logic can be applied here. It's a strong human need to be able to make sense of a very chaotic world. And there's actually a term that's used in the literature for that called collective sense making that refers, sort of to this idea of everyone within a group coming to a consensus in order to understand and cope with a given set of circumstances. So that's a really powerful reason. Okay, so how can we combat fake news? I do realize I kind of, I might be preaching to the choir somewhat here, but there's some really good, of course, the idea is to, what can we use as takeaways here? So what can we do to combat fake news? Well, one of the things we can do is we can expand our news diet. So I just finished a 10-week stint as a media analyst with Ad Fontes Media. And as a librarian, I thought I had a pretty varied news diet. And it probably is more varied than a lot of people's. But I realized that the sources I consult, like on a regular daily basis, that I actually look at on a regular daily basis, they weren't any more than like 4, maybe 5. So that's a good place to start. Expand our news diet. So how can we do that? Well, just as health experts urge us to eat a rainbow of fruits and veggies, we should do the same with our news. Try and eat a variety so that we get all the different kinds of vitamins and nutrients that our body needs. And so when we translate that to the news world, we should try and consult various news sources. And ideally, and I'm still a work in progress, although the work I did with Ad Fontes Media really helped for me to strengthen this. Ideally, this should be on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, again, we're talking fruits and veggies, which are high quality foods, not junk food. So the news sources should be high quality, reliable sources of news. But yes, ideally from the left and the right, and it doesn't have to be extreme either way. If you have left-leaning politics, you don't have to watch Glenn Beck, maybe just read a story or two from Wall Street Journal. If you're right-leaning, you don't have to read alternate, maybe check out a Politico story. So there are also media bias charts out there that can be very helpful for seeing a quick snapshot of where the major news outlets generally stand in terms of their left-right bias. So this is a chart I use a lot with some of my students. It's from allsides.com. It's very simple. It's not complicated. It's not overwhelming. So this is something really good that you can start with, to kind of get your family and friends to start with. It's, it's not too complicated, and it's got pretty familiar news sources on there. So this chart, though, is quite a bit more complicated. This is actually from the group that I've been working with, Ad Fontes Media. So what this chart does is it places the most reliable, least biased, or most objective news sources at the top. I don't know if you can see sort of this little green box. So up at the top there, you've got all these sources. So it's easy to kind of see, which news sources should I be following. So, maybe not all of those, but it definitely goes a long way towards helping to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And the group that I was working with, again, Ad Fontes Media, we've, even just this chart, this is version 6.0, we've made vast improvements to this chart, even just within the past month. So I encourage you to visit the website. Like I said, I'll provide all these sources to Krista and Pat. So I encourage you to visit the website and check it out. And what's really neat is one of the things we worked on, we've got an interactive news chart. So it was literally getting to a point where there are so many news sources on here, it was getting really crowded. So Vanessa Otero, who is the founder of this group, she created an interactive chart that's really cool. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And another really good site to check out is mediabiasfactcheck.com. They don't have a media bias chart per se, but you can plug in just about any news outlet and get an overview of where they stand regarding left-right bias and reliability. So all these sources are great because you can easily share them with friends and family. It sort of takes the onus off of you because you can just say, hey, you know, this isn't just my opinion. It's the people who created this chart. This is something more objective that you can point to. So another way that we can combat fake news is by fact checking. And this has definitely gotten easier over the years. Or at least in some ways, it's gotten easier, right? I mean, there's a lot more information out there. But I remember when Snopes was, you know, kind of the only thing people knew about. Nowadays, there are so many more fact-checking sites. You can even Google. I sometimes have students do this. I say, go on Google. Google the phrase fact-checking websites. And, you know, it'll pull up more than you realize exists. There are a lot of good, reliable fact-checking websites. So a lot of times you can even just take a headline, you know, copy and paste a headline, plug it into Google, and Snopes or one of these other fact-checking websites will likely be at the top. So in a lot of ways, fact-checking has indeed become a lot easier. So it really, some people say, oh, you know, I don't have time to fact check. Well, a lot of people are doing this for you. That's what they do for a living. That's what people who are with Adfontis full time, that's what they do for a living. Okay, so here are some examples of what this might look like. So each fact-checking site has kind of its own way of sort of packaging the story and presenting its verdict. But what they all do, though, is they all cite their information. They cite their sources. They let the reader know that they have verified that information. And what's really cool is just as with any other website, you can just copy and paste the URL, paste it in a Facebook post or a comment, an email, a text. You know, so these fact-checking websites are very easily shareable. So I highly encourage you to share them with family and friends who might benefit from that particular fact check. So that brings me a little closer to my profession and specifically, you know, what are we doing at the college level to help students fight fake news? So like any other educator, academic librarians, we have professional standards to which we must adhere. So the Association of College and Research Libraries is sort of our guiding organization on this. So these 6 frames, as we call them, are what every instruction librarian is going to try and bring into her classroom. Now, we can't cover every frame in every session that we have with students. A lot of times we're only working with students for 1 hour at a time, and we get to see students once, maybe twice during the semester. But, you know, working in 1 or 2 of them, depending on the nature of the assignment that they're working on, is usually pretty doable. So one of the tools that I developed at my previous institution was this fake news research guide. It's kind of busy. You know, I know you can't read all that. I just did a screen grab. When I left Columbia College, I used to teach at Columbia College in Columbia, South Carolina. I took this guide along with me. And I put it up on the SFCC library website when I got here. And I've been, you know, sort of adding to it ever since, keeping it updated. So the first 2 years that I was here, it would get maybe, 300 views in an entire calendar year. As of last night, I checked it. It has racked up over 6,000 views just for 2020. So keep in mind, now this is a freely available resource. It's not like one of our databases where, you know, a student has to log in with their, you know, with their login, their school credentials. This is something that anyone can find. You know, if you Google, I'm not sure what people are Googling to get to this, but so the fact that it's gotten so many hits, it tells me that people are looking for this kind of information. I'm happy about that. That kind of makes me feel encouraged. So I thought that was pretty cool. So one of the things that librarians have used for several years is the CRAB test. This is, and yeah, students get a kick out of this. They love this acronym. So it's an acronym that stands for currency, relevance, accuracy, authority, and purpose. For a long time, this was sort of the gold standard in the instruction librarian teaching world. It was sort of the gold standard for evaluating information. And it's still a great method to use. The only problem is, and it's been around for about 15 years, while it's great for evaluating one single source of information, it doesn't really adequately equip the news consumer of today. The news consumer of today really needs to be able to read across multiple sources and cross-check those sources. So what a lot of librarians are doing today, including myself, is teaching this method called the SIFT method. It was developed by Mike Caulfield, who's the director of blended and networked learning at Washington State University. And, you know, again, I'm lucky if I can see a classroom of students like one time. So even if I only have time to go over, for example, the I and the F, investigate and find better coverage, I found that to be a real aha moment for students. So what's really neat is you can not only do this with information, you can do this with images as well. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to take this methodology for a spin here. So I'm sure actually this is probably something many of us have already done before. I don't know how familiar you are with doing a reverse image search on Google, but a lot of times we see these images, especially in memes. So this is just a really quick, neat thing that you can do. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig just a little deeper than just a basic reverse image search. So here we go. Okay, so we probably remember this image from like a month or so ago, and we probably associate it with some stories as well. Some of those stories may be true, some false. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look. So on a computer, you're going to right-click on the image. Now, if you're on a phone or a tablet, a lot of us are on phones or tablets these days, you're going to touch and hold. So then you're going to select Search Google for Image. Okay, so here's the part where we've got to dig a little deeper. So you're going to quickly scan the results. Now, here's the thing. Google is probably going to throw some really strange stuff at you on the first page. In fact, it says here, possible related search, tree. Okay, I'm honestly not sure why Google thinks a picture of a huge truck filled with mailboxes is a tree, but I mean, I see some trees in the background. Okay. So some of what you're going to be seeing on the first page of results may be pretty off base, but keep scrolling. I tell students that, I tell my friends and family that people just want to kind of gravitate towards, you know, just that first page of results and not search any further. I guarantee you keep scrolling a little bit, couple of minutes, and you're going to see some really good stuff. So probably on the second page or so, you'll see some results that start making sense. So this is what I tell my students, look past the first page of results. So eventually you'll see plenty of news sources against which you can quickly cross-check the veracity of the image. In fact, I see Snopes right here. I see Axios also, so I'm familiar with that source. It's a very trusted source. I'm not so sure about the Sun, but what I'll do, okay, here's my trick. You know, what I'll do is I'll right-click on those sources. I'll right-click on several links and I'll select Open in a new tab so that I can quickly scan, you know, 3, 4, 5 different sources. You know, really to tell you the truth, you might not always, but you might not always have to do deep reading. Sometimes you do. That's always best when you can do deep reading. But if you're just trying to do some quick fact checking, you can consult, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sources, do some triangulation there. So it's all about lateral reading. That's a really big term in information literacy, particularly media literacy right now. So usually it only takes a few minutes of skimming before you come across enough information that gives you sort of the backstory on that image. You might find out, oh no, that image was actually doctored, or no, that's a true image, but it's taken out of context. Or yeah, that's a true image, but that's from 3 years ago. So a lot of times that's what's happening. The image might not be doctored anymore these days. It might be a real image. It might just be taken out of context. Okay, so we're winding down a bit here. So how do we stay sane in today's news and information landscape? So I've got 4 recommendations here. And I'm going to preface this next part by saying that, you know, I will admit I am a work in progress for some of these, but not this first one. Stay news healthy. So just as we want to take care of our body, we should do the same thing to take care of our minds. Try to avoid consuming a lot of junk food or junk news, as it were, and that will go a long way towards maintaining our sanity. Try to educate, not argue. So share what you've learned here. So this person is offering an apple, something healthy. So try to do that. If someone makes a social media post that you suspect is misinformed, try to educate. You probably, you might not actually change their mind, especially on social media, but you're going to at least feel better for at least having tried to gently educate them. Take a break. I'm going to be perfectly honest. After this presentation, I'm probably going to unplug from news for a while. So again, just as our bodies need rest, so do the parts of our mind that deal with taking in current events. And last, know that sometimes you just got to walk away and let it go. There's a difference between friendly discussion, friendly debate, and an outright argument. So the chances are pretty slim, again, that you're going to change anyone's mind on social media. I often think of that Kenny Rogers song. You got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. You got to know when to walk away and know when to run. And I believe the rest of the lyrics goes something like this. You never count your ballots when you're sitting at the table. There'll be time enough for counting those ballots when the election's done, right? Oh, wait, no, I think that's another song. So I think we are at a close. It's pretty much it. I do want to at least briefly show these slides, and because this is just something I always do for my presentations. I always make it a point to show my resources. I will forward this list to Pat and Krista for anyone who's interested. And so here are these awesome fact-checking websites. Again, I will forward that list to Pat and Krista. And here we are. I'm open for questions.